Good morning from Los Angeles and good afternoon to our friends in the Central and East Coast time zones. I'm Arturo Vargas, Chief Executive Officer of the NALEO Educational Fund. NALEO is the National Association of Latino elected and appointed officials. Thank you for joining us for this webinar on census redistricting data and Latino growth. I'd like to first extend an appreciation to my colleagues who helped extensively over the past several days to prepare for this webinar and to conduct analyses of the data that were recently released by the Census Bureau. So thank you to my colleagues, Dorian Codd and Rosalind Gold, and to our communication shop who helped assemble all these data and these slides for this webinar today, especially Freddie Petch, Marcus Silva, Amanda Bosques, and Daniel Ramirez. So thank you to my colleagues. Again, thank you to you for joining us. And let's get started. So again, we're here to talk about census redistricting data and Latino growth. Next slide. Just as a reminder that the census is a key element of the mission of the NALEO Educational Fund. You know, we work every single day to promote the full participation of Latinos in American democracy. And the foundation of that democracy is the Decennial Census. In 2020, we carried out the most comprehensive and extensive campaign in the history of our organization. We launched a national effort to ensure that Latinos were counted in 2020. And as all of us well know, this was the census that experienced the most severe challenges in order to ensure that everybody was counted. So we'll discuss later in this webinar how accurate the census may have been, what are some of the issues that we need to continue to look at in terms of its accuracy. But there are data now that have been released that are numbers that we now have to live with regard to apportionment and redistricting. Next slide. So the redistricting data that were released on October 12th come from what's called the Public Law PL 94-171 legislation. This is legislation that requires the Census Bureau to collect and release data for redistricting to states and localities so that they can begin to redraw electoral maps for congressional districts, state legislative districts, and in many cases, city council districts, county, commission and supervisor districts, school board districts, at all levels of government. The data that were released include numbers on Hispanic origin, race, the population 18 years of age and older, gender, occupied or vacant homes, and people living in group quarters. Now, these numbers are provided at various levels of geography, at the state level, at the county level, at the city level, all the way down to the census block level. And just keep in mind that a census block does not necessarily correspond to a city block, but in many communities it does, and in some, it is actually a larger geography than a city block. Next slide. So what happened in this census, as we all know, there were extensive delays in collecting and processing of the numbers. Now, the Bureau was supposed to have released the apportionment numbers by the end of 2020. It missed that deadline. They were released in April of 2021. And in April 2021, the Bureau was supposed to have released these redistricting numbers. But because of all, again, the delays, the Bureau was not able to release them until just last week. Originally, the Bureau had projected August 16th as its release date of the redistricting data. They were able to get it a few days earlier to August 12th. And they released it in what is called the legacy format. Now, legacy format refers to the format in which the Bureau released the numbers in the 2010, the 2000, and other previous censuses. It's not the easiest format for people to use the numbers, but it's a format for which many states are very familiar, and many states already have begun the redistricting process with these numbers. The very same numbers are going to be released again by September 30th, but they will be formatted and released in a format that is much easier for the public to use. And in fact, they will be easily accessible via a website at data.census.gov. And the Bureau will be distributing DVDs and flash drives with the data, distributing them to all the states, the redistricting authorities, and legislative leaders so that states could, in full manner, begin the redistricting process. Next slide. So, what did these numbers reveal? Just as a reminder, the numbers that we saw in April were only a head count for each state at the state level, and those numbers were used to reapportion the House of Representatives. Now we have data on those numbers all the way down to the census block by race and ethnicity and gender and age, as I mentioned. What we learned is that the Latino population grew from 50.5 million Latinos in 2010 to 62.1 million in 2020, a growth of more than 11 million Latinos. Latinos now comprise more than 18% of the US population, up from 16% in 2010. We continue to be the nation's second largest population group. And let me repeat that. And at Low Educational Fund, we don't use the term that we are a minority population. We are the nation's second largest population group. And with that, I believe, comes a responsibility for policymakers and other individuals in leadership roles to make conscious decisions about how they serve the constituents using a Latino lens, given that such a large share of the US population is now Latino. Next slide. Latino population growth was integral to the nation's growth overall. The rate of Latino growth outpaced the rate of the national growth. Latinos grew by 23%, whereas the nation's population grew by only 7.4%. And in fact, if you account for the nation's non-Hispanic increase, that disparity was even greater. And in fact, Latinos accounted for more than half of the total US population growth in the last decade. Next slide. And all of the states that have the largest share of Latino population also experienced significant increases. Here we have a list of the 13 states with the largest Latino populations. You'll see that in each of these states, Latinos now comprise a larger share of each of these states' population than they did 10 years ago. In California, Latinos are now nearly 40% of the population. The most Latino state continues to be New Mexico, with nearly 48% of this population being of Hispanic origin. And just across the country, we see that Latinos have increased in their share of population in these states. In fact, these 13 states account for 80% of the total US population. But don't forget, Latinos live in all 50 states. And just because we're concentrated in these 13 doesn't mean that there are not significant and important Latino populations in the remaining states throughout the country. Next slide. Now, one of the most significant findings of the 2020 census, just as it was in the 2010 census, is the growth and the changes in the Latino youth population. The census revealed that there is a sizable Latino young population, meaning young people and children under 18 years of age in the country, nearly 19 million Latino youth. So while we account for over 18% of the total US population, Latinos account for over a quarter of the nation's young people and children. What is significant about the youth population in the United States is that the 2020 census revealed that there was, in fact, a decline in the overall youth population by 1.4%. At the same time, that there was an increase of the Latino young population by 9.5%. This means that the nation's young people are becoming much more diverse than the nation's older populations. And any policies that affect young people and children necessarily must be implemented through a Latino lens. anything dealing with reducing poverty, improving access to healthcare, or providing high quality education, any decision maker necessarily must consider how those policies will reach and affect the Latino constituents in her or his jurisdiction. Next slide. And just as Latinos are a larger share of the state population in these 13 states, Latino youth are even a greater share of these states' young populations. In fact, a majority of all young people in 2 states are Latino. That's in New Mexico and California. Texas is just about there, with 48.6% of Texas's young population being Latino, and Arizona and Nevada have more than 40% of all their young people being of Latino background. And you can see just again across the country how a larger share the young population is in these states, which is Latino, which reflects what we have been saying for many years, that the future of this country will depend on the success of our Latino children and youth. Next slide. Another significant finding from the 2020 census is that there has been a migration in some respects from rural counties and communities to large urban centers. In fact, 85% of the nation's population now lives in or very close by a large city. And these top 10 cities with the largest populations reads like a top 10 list of Latino majority cities. New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, Houston, Phoenix, which surpassed Philadelphia, San Antonio, San Diego, Dallas, and San Jose. All of these are the largest metropolitan areas now in the country. They have grown over the past 10 years, and Latino populations increase contributed to that population increase to those metropolitan areas. Next slide. And then when we consider the diversity of the population, this was one of the topics that garnered significant media attention last week when these numbers were first released by the Census Bureau about what is happening with the diversity of the nation's population. We saw, in fact, a decline in the non-Hispanic white share of the total population from 63.7% of the population to 57.8%. Among those who share the people who reported more than one race, there was a very significant increase from 9 million to 33.8 million. And those who reported more than one race, a whopping 567% increase. Now, these increases are more likely attributable to the Census Bureau's changes in the way it coded and it respondent's information. Prior to 2020, if a respondent listed more than 2 racial or ethnic backgrounds, the Bureau will only code 2 of those backgrounds. In the 2020 census, the Bureau was able to code up to 6 of those backgrounds. And we believe that is why we've seen such a significant increase in the number of respondents and Latinos who reported more than one race. But one of the challenges in the collection of race and Hispanic origin data by the Census Bureau is that it continues to have a catch-all category called some other race, a category that the Office of Management and Budget, OMB, does not even recognize. Yet that category now is the nation's second largest racial group. The largest racial group in the country is non-Hispanic white, and now followed by those who identified as some other race, and then followed by those who identified as African American or Black. And the fact is that we know that the vast majority of those who indicated they were of some other race also indicated that they were Latino, which reflects the challenge that the Census Bureau has in providing questions in which Latinos and others can easily self-identify themselves. This again raises the importance of the Census Bureau modernizing the way it collects information on race and Hispanic origin. In fact, the Bureau had conducted 10 years of research in order to develop a more accurate and easier way for all Americans to self-identify their racial and ethnic category, but we're not allowed to by the prior administration. We hope that one of the priorities of this administration now is to return to the recommendations from the Census Bureau and others and the research and develop methods to more accurately collect information on race and Hispanic origin. Next slide. Here we see the components of change of the US population by the Latino population and the non-Latino racial group populations. You see the largest population increase was among Hispanics, over 11 million. That red bar shows the decline in the non-Hispanic white population. There was an increase in the non-Hispanic Black population, a small increase in the non-Hispanic American Indian and Native Alaskan population, a significant increase in the Asian Pacific and Islander population. In fact, as a percentage, the increase of the API population was larger than the increase of the Latino population, but numerically, the Latino population was larger. And again, as we saw, increases in those who identify themselves as some other race and of two or more races. Keep in mind that all of these non-Hispanic categories do not include the Latino population. So in that some other race, only about 1 million people who checked the some other race box indicated they were not Latino. Again, suggesting that the vast majority of those who identify as some other race also identify as being Latino. Next slide. Now, there's been quite a bit of commentary that because of the growth of the Latino population, that this then puts aside any concerns that there may have been an undercount of Latinos. Nothing could be further from the truth. We know not enough yet about the accuracy of the 2020 census. All we know is of the characteristics now of the population that the Bureau originally reported back in April and now has reported for the use of redistricting. The Bureau has not given any indication yet of to what extent were population groups undercounted or overcounted. In fact, we will not know that until next year, when the Census Bureau completes and releases the findings of a survey called the Post-Enumeration Survey, or the PES. The PES is a smaller sample survey conducted of the U.S. population independent of the Decennial Census itself, and is specifically designed to determine the rate by which specific population groups were missed or double counted in the 2020 census. These data are projected to be released in the first quarter of next year, and it will be then that we will be able to have a better understanding of how accurate these numbers were. Already, though, we have a hint as to some of the problems that may have affected the numbers of the 2020 census. Next slide. In December of 2020, the Census Bureau released an analysis of the U.S. population, again, independent of the 2020 census, that's called demographic analysis. Demographic analysis is designed to determine the size of the population in the country by looking at actual births minus deaths and migration patterns. These are hard data that are used to then to develop what are the actual population estimates, the size of the U.S. population based on natural increase, decrease, and again, migration patterns. Now, one of the problems with demographic analysis when it comes to the Latino population is that the demographic analysis is only available for Latinos of ages 0 to 29. And that's because it wasn't until 1990 that all of the states began including a Hispanic identifier on birth and death certificates. You'll recall that demographic analysis, the Bureau also had low estimates, mid estimates, and high estimates of what the population could be in the 2020 census. And many of us were a little surprised that the 2020 census came out on the lower end of those estimates. Now, looking at the demographic analysis of Latinos, and again, this is only for those Latinos ages 0 to 29. A good friend of Naleo Educational Fund and one of the foremost demographers in the country and an expert on data on children, our friend Dr. William O'Hare, conducted a study of the demographic analysis, comparing it to the 2020 census to try to estimate to what extent there may have been an undercount of young Latino children in this census. You'll recall that we at Naleo Educational Fund released a study by Dr. William O'Hare that showed that there was a net undercount of 1 million very young Latino children in the 2010 census. So we rely heavily on the expertise of Dr. O'Hare to give us a sense of what happened and what happens in the census in terms of accuracy. Using that middle range, Dr. O'Hare's research now suggests that the Bureau actually may have missed nearly 832,000 Latino youth, and that's an increase from the 2010 omissions, and that the net undercount of Latino youth in 2020 may actually have been up to 4.4%, where in 2010 it was measured at 2.1%. Next slide. So we continue to have significant concerns about the accuracy of the 2020 census. We need more analysis from sources and from data experts to determine how accurate the 2020 census was. Again, just because the Latino population increased does not suggest then that every single Latino was enumerated in the 2020 census. We won't know that for several more months, but for now, what we do know is that these are the numbers that now we have to live with for purposes of apportionment, which has already occurred, and our redistricting. Next slide. And that brings us back to where we began this conversation, that the redistricting data have been released and the redistricting games have begun. Maps are now starting to be redrawn by state legislators and others to ensure equal population in all the districts. Next slide. Now, the apportionment numbers resulted in a shift of 7 congressional seats among 13 states. And here we have the list of the states that lost one congressional seat and the states that gained a congressional seat. The only exception here was Texas, that gained 2 congressional seats. When these numbers first came out again, this raised questions for us at Naleo Educational Fund about the accuracy of the 2020 census, because some of the states that were projected to gain seats didn't do so, such as Arizona. Florida was estimated to gain 2 seats and only gained 1, and Texas was estimated to gain up to 3 seats, and it only gained 2. And these are large Latino states, as we have seen. So these surprising results raise questions for us, and again, requires further scrutiny. Next slide. As these states begin to redraw their lines, we call upon redistricting authorities, whether they be independent commissions, such as in Colorado, Arizona, California, or in states where legislatures redraw the lines, such as in Texas and Florida, that the components of the change in their states that resulted in a change in their apportionment numbers necessarily be taken into account. So looking at Texas, for example, Texas picked up 2 seats. Well, Latino population growth accounted for half of all the growth in the state of Texas. So arguably, at least one of those new congressional seats should be drawn in a way to allow Latino voters to elect a candidate of their choice. Same thing with Florida. More than half of Florida's population increase was due to Latino population increase. And so in many respects, Latinos are directly responsible for that new congressional seat coming to the state of Florida. Just as in Colorado, where Latinos accounted for 30% of the increase. So as those redistricting processes proceed, we call upon those authorities to make sure that those maps reflect the population shifts. And even in states that lost congressional seats, such as New York and Illinois and California, in all of these states, the Latino population increased. So the loss of those congressional seats in no way should come at a loss of Latino effective districts. In no way limiting the opportunity for Latino voters to elect candidates of their choice. So our role now, all of us as advocates for the Latino community and for full Latino participation in our democracy, need to be vigilant to make sure that this redistricting process is fair. Next slide. So we at Naleo Educational Fund have undertaken a redistricting initiative to ensure that the process is fair, that these changes reflect the population. We're providing resources to community leaders so that they are able to participate in the process. We are calling upon, again, compliance with the U.S. Constitution and the Federal Voting Rights Act. We have called upon the U.S. Department of Justice to increase its resources and capacity so that it could closely monitor all of the redistricting processes in all 50 states to ensure that the process is fair and transparent. We're also providing resources to Latino communities through webinars, workshops, and providing technical assistance so that community leaders can participate in the redistricting process, testify before legislatures, testify before commissions, in order to present hard evidence of where there are Latino communities of interest, where Latino populations have increased and are increasing, so that we have a fair redistricting process. And our work is focused on California with targeted efforts in Florida, New York, North Carolina, and Texas. And we, next slide, invite you to join us in this effort by receiving updates from the redistricting process. If you would like to co-host a webinar on the basics of redistricting, we'd like to hear from you to see how we can work with your community and even co-host some workshops or trainings so that community leaders are informed of what the rules are in redistricting today, what the changes to the law have been, and more importantly, what the numbers show. So with that, thank you again for joining us for this webinar. And I'd like to call upon my colleagues, Rosalind Gold and Dorian Call, to join me to see if any of you have any questions that we could answer. Hi, Rosalind. Hi, Dorian.
Hello.
Good morning. Good afternoon, everyone.
So while we wait for some questions, I'm just going to turn to both of you. Anything I may have left out or something that you'd like to underscore about these numbers?
Well, these numbers are just our first analysis of the data that was released. We will be providing more in-depth analysis on different states, get more information, provide you more information on Latino populations in cities and counties. And please, if you have any specific questions, you can email us if there's a particular area that you'd like to know more about.
Dorian, any thoughts about these numbers?
Certainly. I mean, I think you stated it in a way that sort of illustrates the growth of the Latino community, not only from a 2010-2020 perspective, but the continued growth of the Latino community, especially the under 18 population, the youth population, that again, as you mentioned, is really key, right, in the continued growth of the United States. And that's something that I think a lot of people miss, especially in smaller states where the Latino population might be small, the adult population might be smaller, if you will. However, when we start looking at the trends, especially for that younger population, you'll see that the trends are pretty are pretty not only unique in each state, they're actually in almost all the states where we see some of that growth, where the Latino youth is continued to grow, and it's continuing to make up a larger share of the total population. I'm thinking about North Carolina, for example, Georgia. I'm thinking about Oregon. I'm thinking about Washington.
What
again,
about Pennsylvania? There's a question here about the increase in the Latino population in Pennsylvania.
Certainly. I think there's a lot of different reasons for the Pennsylvania growth. I think we're seeing a trend, as I was mentioning, throughout the United States. So Pennsylvania is not necessarily unique in the sense that it's continued to grow. You certainly have communities also moving to different states that can contribute to that sort of phenomenon, especially in Pennsylvania. We see that in the Puerto Rican population, for example, and not only moving from New York to Florida, but also from the Puerto Rico itself into New York and also Florida, but also other parts of the state. So again, all of this is contributing to the growth, not only in Pennsylvania, but other states as well.
Okay, we have another question here. Will the PES prevent an opportunity to make adjustments to the final count or results of the count? So no, the apportionment numbers are final. They were released in April, and the House of Representatives has been reapportioned for now the next 10 years. And the redistricting numbers that were released on August 12th and again will be released by September 30th, those numbers also are final. What the PES data will give us the opportunity, though, however, is to consider changes or adjustments to numbers that will be used for other purposes, such as public policy decisions. If there is a dramatic undercount, for example, of very young children in particular communities, well, then maybe those local policymakers should take that into consideration when they make decisions on programs that affect children. Same thing for trying to determine distribution of public funds and resources. Getting a better set of the numbers is an opportunity to benefit from the PES.
And there is, even before that, a specific programs not to challenge the counts for apportionment or redistricting, but to challenge the counts for federal funding. It's called the Count Resolution or the Census Challenge Program. Localities and states can go to the Census Bureau and say, hey, for purposes such as federal funding, we'd like you to take a look at the numbers again from our area.
And here's another question. In drawing boundaries at the local levels, are we required to adhere to the lowest variances in population counts between districts, or could the variance be greater? Well, for congressional districts, the tolerance is very low. And in fact, with technology, some states are able to draw their congressional lines with the difference of one person in population size. But that deviation tolerance is greater at a local level. And so for this, I would say you really need to consult local legal authorities as you engage in local redistricting for school districts and city councils. Suzanne Gamboa from NBC News asks us, would you say Latinos have made shifts similar to the overall population from rural to cities, or is the growth more due to births? Dorian, do you have a sense of that?
I think we're still diving on some of the data. However, we are seeing certain patterns, especially when we look at Texas, for example, and we're looking at the border communities, certainly having less or decreasing in population change from 2010 to 2020, for example. However, in places like Houston and other areas where we know that the Latino growth, or at least grew, there was some movement in that sense. Now, is it only attributed to a movement from rural areas to urban areas? Again, we're going to be diving into the data a little bit more, but I would say that it's also attributed to that, but also attributed to births and so forth, especially when we see the growth of the under 18 population, as Arturo mentioned, and we've mentioned already.
And thank you so much for the question, Suzanne. We'd also note that some preliminary analyses, particularly in Texas, is showing that when you talk about growth in cities or more urban areas, a lot of that is in the suburbs. So we're going to be looking at the suburbs of Houston, the suburbs of Dallas, the suburbs of San Antonio. In California, we'll be looking in the whole metropolitan areas around Los Angeles or some of our Southern California counties to see how much of that growth is actually in areas we would think of suburban rather than core city areas.
Here's a reporter from KTR News in Phoenix. Do we think there was an undercount of Latinos in Arizona? Well, again, the apportionment numbers when they were released raised real questions for us about the Arizona count, since Arizona was projected to gain a congressional seat and it did not. And Arizona experienced such a large population increase of Latinos. To us, there are some real questions here about to the extent of an accurate count of Latinos in Arizona. Keep in mind all of the challenges that the Census Bureau encountered in trying to count everybody. First, with all of the interference from the administration, the specter of a possible citizenship question. Our research that we conducted late in 2019, right on the eve of the census, showed that a large segment of Latinos still thought there was a citizenship question to be asked on the census questionnaire. And then once those forms started to be distributed, the pandemic hit and the Census Bureau had to cease operations and extend their operations well into September. All of this to me suggests that while the Census Bureau did yeoman's work in trying to get its job done, the challenges were so great that I cannot but suspect that there was an undercount of Latinos. And we'll know more when the PES is released. For states that lost congressional seats, California, Illinois, New York, and the ongoing increase of Latino populations in these states, what insight can you provide for the distribution of public funds and resources? Well, again, this is where policymakers need to really understand who their constituents are. Who are the people that they represent? And who are the people that they're supposed to be serving? And if you're making decisions without taking into account how those decisions reach and affect Latino populations, then you're missing the mark. In a state like California, where 39% of all the residents are Latinos, whether you're talking about the drought, about wildfires, or about public education, or addressing COVID-19 pandemic, all of these decisions, you need to have a Latino lens in order to make sure you're reaching the population. The same thing goes for Illinois and New York. Our friend Silvia Puente from Chicago wants to know how much of the growth is from U.S.-born Latinos and how much from immigrants. I don't think we know that yet, but I'll ask Dorian for his comment.
Yeah, just really quickly. No, so the numbers, the redistricting numbers, will not have that breakdown. Usually, we rely on other census data, particularly the American Community Survey, to be able to understand the U.S.-born and immigrant population of Latinos. So we'll know more as the Census Bureau releases more data and so forth, but not necessarily from the redistricting data itself.
What is the timeline for the redistricting efforts? Well, they vary from state to state. Rosalind, I'll let you take that on.
Right. Well, different states and localities as well all have timelines that are usually set in the law of the states or in the city ordinances or governing law for counties. So right now, states are all in different places. Some states have actually started to draw draft maps and share them. Some states are still in the process of looking at these numbers, collecting testimony from the public. Wherever states are, though, we believe there really is an opportunity for the Latino community to talk to whichever entity is doing the redistricting and to share their perspectives on how they want their communities to be in the maps. How do they want their communities kept together? For example, communities of interest is something we talk about in redistricting. And community that has shared social or economic or other considerations that they would like to be kept together. Latinos in a community that all live near a freeway may have some things they want to share with a redistricting line drawer about the issues that they face. Latinos that work together to advocate for better education, or Latinos who are in a community where they want to have better access to health care. Redistricting provides Latino community leaders with a chance to have their voice heard when lines are being drawn.
Something else I'd add is that some states have decided to draw initial maps using data from the American Community Survey because the data from the Decennial Census was so delayed. Nothing could have been a more misguided decision by those states. The ACS data, American Community Survey data, are not population counts. The ACS data are population characteristics data. They tell us things like income levels, educational levels, language spoken at home, whether somebody's a citizen or not. It does not tell us accurate numbers about population size to be used in redistricting. And some of these states that drew some of these initial lines now are learning that they were using the wrong numbers for redistricting purposes.
And one of the challenges facing states and localities, especially if they have their first elections in March of next year or even June of next year, is, those lines have to be in place so that election officials can prepare for primaries. And there's a lot of dialogue within different states and localities about how do we get the maps drawn, finalized, get community input about them in time so the lines are ready to go for candidates to run in the first elections of 2022.
Oh, our friend Bill O'Hare, and thank you again, Bill, for the research that you conducted. He wants to know if, in our opinion, why do we think the net undercount of Hispanic children increased so much between 2010 and 2020? I would say that this really requires more research. We joined with others. This is a Partnership for America's Children and our friend Deb Stein to do campaigns specifically targeted at dealing with the undercount of very young children, reminding adults to include all the children in their households, whether or not those children were related to them or not. I think the pandemic may have been a significant effect here. We know that Latinos families were much more disproportionately affected by the pandemic than non-Latino families. The crisis that the pandemic created may, I think, have contributed to participation rates in the census. And this is, again, why it's important for us to study the Post-Enumeration Survey and further analyses of demographic analysis to try to pinpoint where those Latino children were missed and how can we work with the Census Bureau to make sure that the next census doesn't repeat an undercount of young children. Suzanne Gamboa would like to know if we can elaborate on the demographic analysis and accuracy. If the analysis is only 0 to 29 and an undercount of children, why does that lead you to think that numbers are inaccurate? I'm not making the connections and you need to crystallize. Okay, Suzanne. So the demographic analysis that was done for Latinos, again, is for Latinos ages 0 to 29. There were low estimates, mid estimates, and high estimates of what that population size was. And those analyses are determined by looking at actual birth rates, certificates, death certificates, and estimates on migration and immigration and emigration. So that's how the Bureau came up with those hard numbers. Then the next step was to compare those hard estimates with the actual 2020 census. And in that comparison, demographers such as Dr. O'Hare actually saw a discrepancy of how many children should have been counted in the 2020 census based on these numbers from birth certificates, death certificates, and migration patterns. So that's the discrepancy that suggests that there may have been an undercount that occurred.
if I may add too, for Susan's question, there's two different things that we're looking at, right? Or at least right now there are two buckets, right? The first is the under 18 population, and particularly trying to figure out whether there was an undercount, knowing what we know about our not only our previous research, but certainly William O'Hare's research around this particular topic. The other part is the overall Latino population, and whether the overall population, whether there was an overall undercount, a net undercount of the Latino population as a whole. One of the indications that we were looking at, particularly leading up to the count and then into the count, is one, doing surveys and understanding how the community, Latino community specifically, were going to be looking at the census and how they might engage with the census. The second thing is tracking self-response rates as the Bureau was releasing them down to the census tract level, and then looking at any patterns that may exist that might tell us or indicate that there was a lag in self-response in any particular area that we knew were problem areas. Mainly for two reasons, right? One is to understand where those discrepancies were, and the second part was really to, through our programmatic work and our partners and so forth, is to address those particular lags that might be occurring. However, as we got closer and closer to the final count, certainly we were seeing more and more of this. It's still not moving. In the case of Arizona, for example, in the update leave areas where the operations, as Arturo had mentioned, Census Bureau had a tremendous job to be able to do all of this in spite of a pandemic and so forth. But the numbers were still lagging. So all this to say that now when we're looking at the numbers and when the numbers were initially released, knowing all the information that we're looking at, as Arturo mentioned, it warrants further scrutiny. It certainly warrants further data points that we can then use to be able to analyze and be able to know whether there was a net undercount and by how much, so we can understand exactly how many Latinos were potentially missed during this 2020 census count. And again, all this to say is that we're going to be looking at this even more as we get more and more data, which the Bureau will continue to release, and others will continue to release more research, like William O'Hare's research.
And Marisa Perez wants to know how we can support the work of elected officials in local redistricting efforts. So I'll kick that over to Rosa.
Yes, so thank you so much. So there's a couple of ways we can help. We can at least tell you whom you should be talking about to find out about the particular criteria and process that governs your particular redistricting. We can also provide you with some ideas about best practices for mobilizing community members, or if you're a line drawer, for making sure that you set up hearings where there are meaningful opportunities and good accessible opportunities for Latino community members to have a chance to participate in the process. So please reach out to us directly.
Oh, our friend Walter Tejada wants to know if we have any information yet on what the impact of the failed efforts to include the citizenship question may have had on the numbers, particularly high immigrant and Latino areas. We really don't know to what extent the citizenship question debacle had on the accuracy of the census, but we do know, based on the focus group research that we conducted in late 2019, right before the census started, that many Latinos were apprehensive about participating in the census because of the conversation that had occurred in the country around the citizenship question, and many of them still believing that there was going to be a citizenship question on the form itself. And in fact, even in the 2018 dress rehearsal, or the end-to-end test that was conducted in Providence, Rhode Island, as a lead up to the 2020 census, many Latinos in that test census thought there was a citizenship question and were hesitant to participate. So I do think that there was an impact. To the extent of its measure, we don't yet know. Is there a greater number of Latinos self-identifying as white? There was before census data that Latinos more often identified as indigenous. Is that growing? I don't know if we've had a chance to do that level of analysis. Dorian?
Yeah, We're going to be doing a little bit more of that diving in once we get the final file, if you will, the PL file in September. Right now, we do have some information on the non-Hispanic breakdown of race groups. We do not have it for the Hispanic breakdown of those race groups down to lower geographies, where we would like to look at, county level and city level, and to see if there's any shifts or changes to that level. But more coming certainly in the near future from us.
Can we show a breakdown of Latinos and more granular level, assuming Mexican largest? Can you share what follows? So I think this question is referring to national origin groups.
Right. And as I mentioned before, same applies to the nationality, ethnicity, and so forth, where we'll be able to look at that even further once we get a little bit more data from the census, particularly for those different groups, and we'll be able to look at that a little bit further.
So to elaborate on that, Dorian, right now all we know is who's Latino and non-Latino. We don't yet know how many identified as Mexican American, Puerto Rican, Cuban, Salvadoran, Dominican, and so forth.
That is correct. And once we get that information, or that data rather, then we can dive in a little bit more on that.
Our friend Gloria Rubio Cortez says that in Colorado has drawn its own maps for redistricting. Are we doing that in California or elsewhere? And I'll kick that over to Rosalind.
Yes, thank you. We are not drawing maps in any state, but we are working closely with Latino voting rights and civil rights organizations, such as the Mexican American Legal Defense and Educational Fund, or Latino Justice PearlDeaf, in states such as California, New York, Texas, North Carolina, and Florida, to mobilize Latino community members to participate and talk about their communities, so that the information that the commission or the line drawers get reflects how Latino members, community members, feel about their community. And we're also making sure that those voting rights organizations have that information that we get from community members about how Latino community members see their communities, and that will help inform the lines they present to whoever the line drawers are.
Thanks, Rosalind. Hector de Leon's perspective: is there a need to educate stakeholders, media, and general public on the difference between population and citizen voting age population, and how the difference is reflected in votes to temper electoral expectations? Well, the census data itself does not have citizen voting age population. It only has voting age population, 18 and over. The citizen voting age population is derived from the American Community Survey. And again, those are estimates. They're not actual headcount numbers. But those numbers are used to try to estimate the number of Latino citizen and non-citizens, as well as other population groups, as the redistricting process proceeds. But your point is well taken. Population growth, or just the overall Latino population, does not necessarily reflect the overall Latino electorate. The one caveat to that I would say, however, is when you look at the young population, the Latino population under 18, overwhelmingly, over 90% of Latino under 18 years of age are U.S. citizens. So as that population matures, they will be entering the electorate.
And I just wanted to quickly add, I think the other thing this point highlights and underscores is that drawing fair lines for Latinos to have an opportunity to choose responsive and accountable elected officials is just the one piece of Latino civic empowerment and engagement. We also have to continue nonpartisan voter engagement work so that Latinos can utilize those opportunities, can register to vote, can become U.S. citizens, can do all the things they need to do to be able to have a voice in our democracy.
Terrific. Thank you, Rosalind. Well, let me take this opportunity now to thank everybody for joining us for this webinar. Again, this is initial analyses that we've been able to produce of the redistricting data that gave us the first glimpse of the size of the Latino population in the United States as of 2020. And we will continue to be doing more analyses as well as state profiles and advocating to make sure that policymakers are well aware of these numbers and take them into account as they proceed with the redistricting process and all other policies that they consider and implement going forward to make sure that we fully incorporate the Latino population in all aspects of our democracy and our society. So please stay tuned. We will be producing more analyses and information. Once again, thank you to my colleagues, Roslyn Gold, Dorian Call, and our fantastic communications team for putting all this information together and for carrying out this webinar. Thank you for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you in person someday real soon. Thank you.